So I thought I'd opine on this news that the British government, in its wisdom, has decided that 16-year-olds can now vote. They've just decided that by fiat, and so that's what's going to happen. A couple of thoughts on this. First thing, this is by no means a new idea. So I am an old person, and in the first election that I was involved in, the one in 1997, that was a very popular idea amongst the left and the Labour Party even back then. As it happened in 1997, I was 17 and I couldn't vote in that election because my birthday came a couple of months after the election. But I could tell that there was something. I hadn't been particularly political up until that point, but I just looked at Tony Blair and I could just tell that there was something wrong about this man, and I didn't trust him, and so I got involved and I campaigned for the other side. Didn't work. He won a massive landslide and he changed the country forever. If you're unfamiliar with the history of Britain over that period and how it changed, you can basically get the same sense by watching the 28 Days Later franchise, because in that universe it's exactly the same as what actually happened. Something happened in 1997, and from that moment onwards, we were overrun with mindless, feral individuals who completely ruined Britain. It's entirely the same story, whether it's real life or the 28 Days Later franchise. So, why were left-wingers in favour of that, even back then and most likely before? And I think it's because they assume that it's going to be good for them. And back in the day, back then, previous elections, they probably would have been right. If you're 16, most of the adults, the vast majority of the adults that you interact with are going to be working for the state. I mean, yes, you've got your parents and grandparents who maybe they don't work for the state, and maybe one or two friends of the family, but for the most part, it's going to be teachers and people in the NHS, stuff like that, maybe the odd police, whatever it is. But your overwhelming influence, especially the amount of time in the day, is going to be at school, and it's going to be surrounded by left-wing individuals. And so for that reason, I had always been against the idea of 16-year-olds voting, because I do believe that if my generation had been allowed to vote at 16, I mean, yes, I might have been an exception, but most of them probably would have voted for the most left-wing option, which would have been the Labour Party. However, I'm not sure that logic necessarily holds up in a day when we've got better information. You see, back then, information was very curtailed. You got the view of whatever your teacher said, and you got whatever was on TV. And that was overwhelmingly sort of biased and left-wing. And yes, you had a sense that what these people are telling you, I don't trust them. I think they're full of it, but you didn't know why, because there was no countervailing narrative that you could get your hands on. I mean, occasionally, I suppose you might find a book or a pamphlet or something that went the other way, but generally not. I mean, most of us were not going to pubs listening to Bowden speeches on how what a complete mess that was being made of the nation. So you only ever got the left-wing perspective. BBC used to present itself, which was a primary source of information for most people back in those days. BBC used to try and present itself as showing both sides of the argument, but I mean, it didn't. I mean, on things like climate change was the most overt. They simply, and that was coming in when I was a younger. That was just starting to manifest. They just wouldn't have somebody in from the other side, and even if they did have somebody in from the other side on most political debates, they'd make sure that they chose people who either couldn't make the argument effectively or would tacitly agree with it, but would disagree on some minor aspect of implementation. And generally, it was all, yes, the state needs to get bigger, the state needs to do more, but the other guy would say, but we need to do a study first, or maybe we can only do this up to a point. So the effect is that you just didn't have an alternative viewpoint that you could even put your finger upon, so therefore you couldn't articulate your opposition to whatever it was putting across. You just had these sort of vague suspicions. You see, young people today, they do have that. They have the internet. They have access to as many contrary narratives as they like. More than that, they can see that the world used to be a better place. They can watch 90s movies and they can see that when my generation were young people, it was just simply a better life. Apparently Zoomers don't even know what a house party is. They just don't do these things. They don't have the level of homogeneity in their communities. They didn't have anywhere near the level of sort of trust in their neighbours and their institutions and all of that stuff. And it's very obvious to them at this point that they've got a raw deal. I mean, they genuinely have got a raw deal. And they know that things used to be better. And they know that the liberal world order has been in ascendancy in the period when all of this decline and stagnation happens. And I mean, going back to the schools, now anyone who's vaguely switched on will have the sense that I would have had back in those days, that these people are blagging you about something, but you don't know what it is. But, what I hear from, the occasional base teacher that I speak to is that, yes, many of these youngsters today are right little commies like they always were. But, the other half of them, they're all Andrew Tate fans. No, I'm not a fan of Andrew Tate. I mean, he's got this sort of fax masculinity that's trying too hard. The lady doth protest too much, I think, with Andrew Tate. I don't think that somebody like Sulla or Caesar or Alexander the Great would have been literally bellowing out, these invectives like Tate does, and it all seems a bit forced from my point of view. But at least he is unapologetically masculine and unafraid to assert the masculine value in society. And there's many other voices that young people can have access to today that are sort of pushing back on this. And what it leads me to is, take, for example, the AFD. So votes were, apparently being opened up recently for 16-year-olds in Germany as well. As ever with these ideas, they don't happen in just one place. They tend to ripple around the world, and we all have to pretend that it's just a idiosyncrasy of our particular country. But no, somebody at a higher level has decided, no, we're doing 16-year-olds for voting now. But how has that worked out? So, this is a poll from the last election when it was 18s and above. And this poll looks at 18 to 24-year-olds. Well, how did they go in the last election? Well, overwhelmingly for the AFD. Because these young people could see that their culture is collapsing and they need to do something fundamentally different. If you're wondering, the second party there, De Linke, 16%, it's a long way down from 38%, but that is the that is the successor to the Germanist Communist Party. But my point is that young people are not clustering in the centre. You see, they're not going for the CDU or the SDP. They're abandoning the centre because they can see that the centre, this whole globalist, centralist, liberal project has failed them. They're going out to the fringes, overwhelmingly for the AFD, but also a little bit for the Communist Party. But they've abandoned it. Now, Labour suspect, because they formed this worldview a very long time ago, that it was going to benefit them. But by the time they got around to implementing it, I really don't think that is going to be the case. I think, actually, the prime beneficiaries of this are going to be whatever the most radical right-wing party available is. Now, at the moment, that might be Reform, but hopefully we're going to get an actual right-wing party at some point. And actually, there will be very little benefits accruing to Labour because we've got this new Jeremy Corbyn party, what we're calling Jezbollah party. I think that's going to suck up a lot of those. And the other thing you've got to remember is that a lot of the young people in the UK today have particular ethnic considerations. They identify more with Gaza than they do with the Cotswolds. Are they going to vote for Labour? I mean, historically, that demographic has voted for Labour, but only because it's a tool that gets them to a certain point. Now, this last election, we saw multiple openly Islamic MPs enter the House of Parliament. I think there's 5 or 6, depending on whether you count Jeremy Corbyn or not as one of them. It's going to be, parties like George Galloway or just a nakedly, openly Islamic party will form at the moment. You know, they're exiting their time of using Labour Party as a vehicle for that. They seem to be using the Green Party to an extent for it today. But you'll just get the emergence of openly Islamic parties that are openly and unapologetically for their group against the host nation. So that's where a lot of the vote will go. Maybe some of the more indigenous Brits, young Brits, will be going for reform or whatever the most right-wing party available at the time is. And actually, none of this, I don't think, is going to help the Labour Party, despite the fact that they've spent, 20 years trying to get to the point where they could implement this. So I don't think it's going to help them. But more than that, another thing that makes me fascinated by this change is that it shows that the government can, at its whim, change the franchise. Well, that's interesting, because if they can do that, then why can't we change the franchise again? Why can't we, make some political gains? And the moment you've got at the barest of majorities in Parliament, well, you could change the franchise to be people with British ancestry get to vote, or at least were born in the UK get to vote. The moment you do that, the next election becomes very interesting, and you might actually get the sort of reforms that could save us.